Okay. All right. I talked with Chris last week or 2 weeks ago, just going back over the topic, and I will be honest, it took me a while to figure out how to incorporate a B and being kind, but I think we finally got there. Everything sound all right?
Yeah, you're good.
Awesome. But tonight we're going to spend hopefully 45 minutes on the idea and topic of being kind as Christians. But before we get there, I will just go back over a few things that Chris mentioned. I'm Kelly's cousin. Some of you also might know me as the preacher at Pine Grove, about 22 minutes, I think is what it took to get here down the road. I'm also a 2016 and 2017 graduate of the Memphis School of Preaching, and I work with the Scattered Abroad Network, which is a network of podcasts that go out every day so that we can have more Bible study together. But beside all of that, and arguably most importantly, I'm married for now 5 years and 2 weeks, give or take a few days. So it has been a whirlwind of a marriage with COVID in the middle, but we're here now. How can we as Christians learn from a honeybee? There's not a ton that we can, really. Except the basic idea if somebody gets too close to us, it's okay to sting them, right? I mean, that's kind of how I feel. If you spend a lot of time around me, I'm very outgoing until my people radar or a battery gets drained, and then it's not as outgoing. But that's not what we as Christians ought to be. The whole idea is to be kind as Christians. Paul will mention in his letter to the Ephesians, in Ephesians chapter 4, verses 16, talking about everything that the body supplies needs to be together. But down later in the chapter, verses 30 and 31, 31 and 32, Paul is saying that Christians, we ought not to be so focused on anger, on envy, on strife, on any of these things. But he goes into verse 32 and says, but that we be kindly affectioned one towards another. So when we think as Christians on how to be kind, it really boils down to what the definition of kind really is. I, I'll admit there are some words that I use that I have never really looked at the textbook definition for. Have you ever stopped to look up what kindness actually is? I'll give you a hint. It's really annoying. Kindness is the act of being kind. It's just one of those dif- uh, d- uh, definitions that are just downright obvious. But the idea of being kind is being friendly, being courteous, and being generous to one another. So when we stop and think about how we as Christians are to be kind, I want us to think about two areas where we can be friendly, we can be courteous, we can be generous, and that's first of all to the hive. How is it that you view your fellow Christians? When you stop and you think about the people who make up this body here at this location, how do you feel about them? Hopefully, you feel good. Hopefully, you feel like you love them and that this is where you belong. Because that's the truest idea. We need to be and show ourselves as Christians friendly. Solomon would say that if a man wishes to have friends, he must show himself friendly. Nobody wants to be a friend with someone that looks like they just ate a lemon. It starts to grate on you after a while. But what does it mean to be kind to the hive? Well, we need to stop and look at biblical precedents. To begin, we have this viewpoint that to be kind, it's to help one another. How often is it throughout your Christian life that you have had a Christian help you in some way? How often have you helped another Christian in some way? It's easy to say, I'm going to help you in some way. Or it's even easier to say, if you need anything, just give me a call. And then the second your phone rings, you think, oh no, I messed up. That's not how we as Christians need to be thinking about helping one another. I've known of Christians who have refused to have their name announced in the assembly when they were sick with cancer because they didn't want the spotlight on them. They said, and I quote, I don't need that right now. One person had a knee replacement, said, I just don't need the prayers. When we stop and think about being kind to the hive, we have to stop and realize what the church of the first century did. Acts chapter 2, right after they had first become Christians, right after 3,000 souls were baptized, what does it begin to say? They had all things in common. They continued steadfastly in the apostles' doctrine, and they had all things in common and sought to help one another. They continued having fellowship meals. They continued being together. They continued studying together. Even in Acts chapter 4, now hardship has come. Because if you start to look at the broad scope of what happened on the day of Pentecost, it starts to put Acts chapter 3 and 4 in a little brighter context. Everyone who became a Christian on Pentecost most likely would not have had their home in Jerusalem. The most common practice was people would come up for the Passover feast. They would stay for about the 50 days until Pentecost, and then they would go home. But as we read through Acts chapter 2, 3, and 4, it reads as those who became Christians, most of them stayed in Jerusalem. They stayed where they could study from the apostles and learn from the apostles. They stayed so that they could be together as a unit, as a body, and even contextually for the VBS theme, as a hive, so that they could work together. You come to the end of Acts chapter 4, however, and now there's hardship. Now there's a need for funds. That's really when we're first introduced to Barnabas. Barnabas is mentioned as the son of consolation because he had land. He sold it and gave all of the proceeds to the congregation so that he could help Christians. When we stop and look at what a bee is, they produce honey not for us, not really. What they produce honey for is their livelihood. Some of you might know, because I think Kelly has been talking about it, my dad just recently started keeping bees. As of last summer, he started getting into it and wanting to get bees. Well, I think it was in March. I was getting ready to go to bed. Truthfully, I wasn't getting ready for bed. I was doing something, I don't remember what, at 8:45 at night. And my mom texted me and said, we're going to the hospital. Your dad was in an accident with his hand. I'll call in a few minutes. You can imagine that's not a fun text to get. The table saw had slipped, or rather the wood had slipped and cut his thumb. He still has it. It's slowly getting back to normal, but in that, I learned a valuable lesson. Not with Dad cutting off his thumb, that was a side story. Bees help their own kind. Bees are going to do everything in their power to produce the livelihood for their hive. They're going to do everything that they can to keep that queen and therefore keep their hive fruitful and flourishing. What is it that we can do to help our local congregation? What is it that you can do to help 2nd Street? I don't know. This is honestly, I think, the second time I've been in this building. I don't know what this congregation needs. I don't know what has happened over the past few years. I don't know if there's any vacancies or any voids that are being felt. But if you're anything like Pine Grove, I can say there is. Because life goes on. Life is difficult. The congregation will need help to continue to grow and flourish, but that also means that we as Christians need help. Galatians chapter 6 and verse 10 is a verse I want us to try and remember. I won't say memorize, but at least remember or mark in your Bibles, because this is perhaps the biggest highlight of this sermon. As you have opportunity, see that you do good unto all men, and especially unto them of the household of faith. Being kind is simply doing good. How is it that we as Christians do kind, or be kind rather? By helping out the congregation, by being kind to the hive, and especially not dividing it. What good would a hive be if there's only one queen, but all of the sudden the hive is splitting at its seams because one half doesn't want to follow follow the queen, and the other half thinks it's the best idea to follow after the queen? It doesn't work. You're not going to have the productivity, you're not going to have the effort, and you're not going to have the product as a whole. How often is it that the body becomes divided? We have the young adults, we have the adults, we have the older aged, we have the kids, and we never work together as a whole. How often is it that we sit over here and we sit over there, and by the time someone asks us how someone in the congregation is doing, we say, I don't know. I haven't talked to them in a few months. They're there all the time, but they're just on the other side of the building. I'm willing to bet it's not more than 45 steps from that corner to this corner of the building. We cannot be dividing the body if we're seeking to be kind to the body. We cannot be simply saying, well, I sit on this side and they sit on that side. The church at Corinth had a huge problem with division. To name a few topics that they were divided on, it was who baptized them. It was on what spiritual gifts they had, what spiritual gifts they wished they had, how willing they were to accept adultery within their midst, how much money they had, what food they brought for the Lord's Supper. This congregation was so divided that Paul said, I'm glad that I baptized none of you except for this small handful. I pray that this congregation is nowhere near that bad. It is a sad fact, though, that a lot of congregations have tiny tears in them rather than great gulfs of division. To be kind to the church, to be kind to the hive, we have to be willing to focus, willing to grow closer to one another. Because we can dig into many other verses. I mentioned Ephesians chapter 4 to begin. Ephesians 4:31 and 32. Don't focus on anger. Don't focus on division. Don't focus on all of these things. But grow in kindness. Grow in love. Be Christians, because that's the only way we are going to be productive. What good is a honeybee that doesn't produce honey? Effectively, it's not good. What good is a Christian who isn't working? Now, I want to say this, working means a whole lot of different things to different people. Not everyone is going to be a preacher. Not everyone is going to be an elder or a deacon. Not everyone's going to be the best personal evangelist. I know some people who know their Bibles backwards and forwards, but the second they open up their mouths to talk to someone, it's just their God-given voice or trained voice perhaps, but they come off like a Brillo pad. Those aren't necessarily the best people to open doors, but they might be the best people to encourage. They might be the best people to sit down with faithful Christians and continue to grow. When we stop and realize what we need to be doing as Christians, it looks different for all of us. But there are individual things that all of us are supposed to be doing. Continue. Be not weary in well-doing. 1 Corinthians chapter 15 and verse 58. Paul is telling the Corinthians that death is swallowed up in victory. Excuse me. Death is swallowed up in victory because Christ has died for us. And we can have a home in heaven if we're not weary in well-doing. Keep up and fight the good fight. Christ would even go into telling a parable of continuing, of laboring, of serving faithfully. Matthew chapter 20, verses 1 through 16. The labor is great. The need is great. The work that we ought to be doing is great. But the laborers are few. It hasn't been very long. I think it's still technically going on that people have been saying, save the bees, because apparently they're disappearing. There's a small number compared to what there really needs to be of bees. If we look at the world, I mentioned it Sunday morning at Pine Grove, which is, by the way, why this lesson seems so put together. It's because this is the second time I've preached in 3 days. There's roughly 7 billion people in the world. I say roughly because people are being born and people are dying every day. Could be closer to 8 billion. I'm not sure. The last survey that was done, there is roughly 100 million New Testament Christians. Do we realize how small that number is compared to the billions of people in this world? And I want to say this as well. America is starting to shrink in its New Testament Christian population. There are other places in the world that it's growing. That means we have our word cut out for us. That means to continue to be faithful in the command which Christ gave to all of His disciples. Matthew chapter 28 is to go into all the world and teach the gospel to every creature. That's not an if statement. I've even had people look at me and say, well, that's just for the apostles, because that's who He was talking to at that point, but they stop reading because they want all of that responsibility off of them. They want to say, well, that's for the apostles, that's for the preachers, that's for the elders to do, that's not on me. But if we keep reading Matthew 28, go ye therefore and teach all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Ghost, teaching them to observe all things whatsoever I have commanded you. Did you know that statement means that as New Testament Christians, we must observe the verse prior? to go and teach. As Christians, the greatest idea of being kind, being friendly, being generous, being courteous is getting up and going to work. Because the truth is, if we don't, we're looking at a world that is lost and dying and say, I don't care about you. How many people do you know that need the gospel? How many people is it that you know and you love that aren't Christians? What was the last thing you did for them? When was the last time you talked to them about the Bible? Because you see, if we just focus on being kind to the hive, we start to isolate ourselves. We start to put ourselves in a nice little bubble, and nothing can hurt us, and nothing can bother us, but we're never going to grow. We can't just be kind to ourselves. We have to start to be kind to the world. Honeybees are so important because they pollinate. I couldn't think of the word, honestly, in preparation for this sermon until the video. And I was like, pollination. I should have known that. When was the last time we as Christians went out pollinating? When was the last time we took that life-giving nectar of the gospel of Christ and went to go tell someone about it? Better yet, when was the last time you cared so much about the Word of God that you couldn't help talking about it? I don't know what sports season it is. I think it's the end of college baseball, the end of NBA, and a few other things. I know for a fact because I was born and raised in Alabama. I know what the state sport is there. I'm quickly learning what it is in Mississippi, too, by the way. And that's coming up real quick. That's college football. I've known a lot of people who can tell me every single stat of every single player on every single team in the SEC. And they were so happy and so excited to talk about one specific player who did one thing 10 years ago. But they could not tell me a single thing about the Bible. I'm not talking about someone who's never been a Christian before. I'm talking about a person who was 35 years old and who has been a faithful, at least in attendance, Christian for 20 years. If we truly care about it, we're going to be exuding it, right? Bees get so much nectar, they go home, they give the honey out, and then they go right back out to keep spreading it, right? The hive is just kind of the refueling station to keep doing their job. How often is it that we go out and seek to help the world? Let's go back to that definition of kind for a minute. It's friendly, it's courteous, and it's generous. Friendly is that idea of seeking to be a friend to someone. That's another annoying definition, isn't it? I was always taught never use the word in its definition. We need to tell dictionaries that again. But courteous is another one. And this is the one that really shocked me. Because I always thought courteous was just holding the door open for someone, right? If there's one thing left, let someone else get it. One slice of pumpkin pie at Thanksgiving, well, I'll let someone else have that. No, it's not seeking to harm them, seeking to be peaceable, and by every extent, not trying to upset someone. But I want us to stop and think what that means to us as Christians. that does not give us credit to say, I want to be courteous, and so therefore I'm not going to tell someone that they're wrong. What's going to hurt someone worse? Being told that they're wrong, which, by the way, there's a nicer way of putting that than just, you're wrong, or someone spending eternity in hell? Which one is actually more courteous? Therefore, which one is actually more kind? I would dare say, seeking to save that soul. We go back to Galatians 6:10, the verse I want us to remember and take out from this sermon. Do good unto all men. That can also be referenced back as all mankind. That doesn't mean that we just seek to be good to those within these four walls. That doesn't mean that we just seek to be good to the Christians that we know. That means we seek to be good to the people down the street, to the people who might not be the most kind to us, to the people who don't look like us, to the people who don't sound like us, to the people who don't act like us, to the people who don't believe like us. It's okay to not like the situation in which they are living. But it's another thing to look at someone and say, I don't agree with their lifestyle, so I'm going to perceive that they will not listen to the gospel. We cannot be that kind of person. Because to be like a honeybee, we have to be kind to Christians. But we also have to be kind to the world, because the whole point of Christ's mission and goal, as He told all of those people who were questioning Him when He was going to go home and be a guest with Zacchaeus, doesn't He know who He's going to be eating with? Doesn't He know who He's going to go spend His time with? He's a publican. He's a tax collecting thief. And yet Christ said, I came to seek and to save the lost. We as Christians need to be about that same mission, because James says pure religion and undefiled before God and the Father is this: to visit the fatherless and the widows in their affliction. That doesn't just mean the fatherless and the widows within the congregation. Now, there's also a very important statement at the end of this that I want to make, because he goes on to say, and to keep oneself unspotted from the world. It is possible to go out and to preach and to teach and to seek to save the lost and to still be unspotted from the world. We need to be in the world and not of the world. That means we need to go seek and to save the lost, but that doesn't mean we have to go sit at the bar to do it. We need to be kind and help, but that boils down to the simple fact that we need to be kind to the world by teaching the world. It has always astounded me, Paul's missionary journeys. In fact, before we get there, I just want to point out another thing about Acts chapter 2. Historically speaking, within Jerusalem, there would have been roughly 1 to 2 million people between the time of the Passover and the Pentecost. That's a lot of people. That's a lot of people that heard that gospel sermon in Acts chapter 2. But that also starts to put into perspective that there was only 3,000 that were saved. You might not have the best success in going and teaching the lost. But we need to be like the sower in the parable of the sower. What did he do? The sower went out to sow seed. It's amazing that that is all that's mentioned about the parable of the sower, or rather the sower in a parable about him. So many times we focus on the soil and say, well, yeah, he went to sow the seed, but we don't want to be the hard soil. We don't want to be the thorny soil. We don't want to be the stony soil. We need to be the good soil. You're right. But with all due respect, that's not what is being mentioned here. That's just realizing what's going to happen. The truth is, it's the parable of the sower, and the sower went out to sow seed. Some fell by the wayside. What did the sower keep doing? He kept sowing seed. Some started to spring up and started withering away. He kept sowing seed. Some found the good soil. And by implication, by the language given, he kept sowing seed until that seed was gone. How often are we sowing the seed? There's the song, I hope you sing it here. It's a good song. I'll say this and I might ruin the song for you in a second. Are you sowing the seed of the kingdom, brother? It's a great song. Now, I apologize for this next part because there's a space in that last word in the song that I'm going to be honest, sometimes boils down to you and me. Are you sowing the seed of the king, dumb brother? Second to last word, excuse me. That's our goal as Christians. That's what we're supposed to be. It's all well and good if inside the building looks good. But did you know that at some point you're going to die? At some point, a lot of the children that are here might move off. And they might flourish and do good things to a congregation that's not here. What are we doing to replenish the numbers here? What did Paul do? Acts chapter 17, as he's in one of his journeys. He's in Athens. Mind you, he is close to the Parthenon. This massive temple with hundreds of pillars. In fact, it's still there, some of it. I think Nashville has a recreation of it that's smaller. And the Apostle Paul starts preaching. It's pretty simple, right? Some people started hearing him and said, hold on, this is something new. Let's bring you to a better spot so that more people can hear you. And Paul starts out, sometimes we might think it's snarky. I perceive that you are too superstitious. If you have the New King James, I think it's the New King James. It has the same Greek words, just put in more modern way of saying it. You're overly religious. You're too welcoming of different things. You're too open to all of these different ideas. In fact, you have a temple, or rather a statue, to the unknown God. Paul said, I'm going to preach to you about Him. You want to be religious? I'll give you somebody to be religious towards. And he preached. Now let's also put into perspective something else. Shortly thereafter, in our Bible, some time later, Paul would state that he wanted to go see Caesar. He had already been beaten. The Roman soldiers had broken Roman protocol because he was a citizen. In fact, he wasn't even a person who had bought his citizenship. He was a natural born Roman. And instead of going to the sheriff, going to the town constable, or anything else, he invoked his right as a Roman citizen to take his case to Caesar, to the highest office in the land. That would be effectively arrested for a speeding ticket and saying, no, I want to go see the president about this. Just putting that into perspective for us. But let's also think about this. Paul was determined to go and to see Caesar. Who was Caesar at that point? It would have been Nero, a man who was well known and is still well known for being the man who would imprison Christians, who would feed them to dogs, who would have them beaten, who would have them dipped in tar, shoved on a stick in his garden, and lit on fire at night, mind you, while they were still alive. He burned down half of Rome so that he could build his own complex and pinned it on the Christians. And yet Paul said, I don't care about that because he is a soul and he needs the gospel. Yes, we need to be kind to the hive in here because we're the ones that are propelling each other. As a side note, we like talking about Hebrews 10:25, not forsaking the assembling of ourselves together as the manner of some is. Back up a verse. Let's provoke one another. That language is to stir up or to stoke the flames. Let's provoke one another to love and good works. We need the congregation. We need to be working as a team. But we don't need to be so blinded by what's in front of us in here that we forget that there's souls out there. We need to be kind as Christians to the hive and be kind as Christians to the world. And I think for once, I'm pretty much done on time. So I thank y'all for your kind attention, and hopefully I get to have some good snacks here in a minute. Thank y'all.